when the rivers of the Lake Eyre Basin were flooding, I was flying over the top of those rivers, but 2 days later, I'd be over a massive Channel Country floodplain. And you really start to think not only about the ecological response, but the potential there for, major disruption of these magnificent systems. And I think when I really got into the river debate and the issues around water management, it was after flying over the Macquarie Marshes for a few years and starting to really appreciate some of the major declines that were occurring as a result of what was happening hundreds of kilometres upstream.
Welcome to Ecology Matters, a podcast from the Ecological Society of Australia. In each episode, meet a different ecologist, discover what makes them passionate about Australian ecology, what their hopes and fears are for the future of our natural world, and why they think that ecology really does matter.
I knew I was going to be a field biologist.
I was like, yes, this is what I want to do.
I found that I had a real connection with the land in that area.
I don't think I'm going to be getting bored in the next 5 years, that's for sure.
I'm really interested in changing the world.
So yeah, I think it is going to make a big difference, which is exciting.
I think that's really cool to see that can actually make a really significant difference.
People are starting to appreciate cultural knowledge a lot more than what it would have been appreciated in the past.
I'm really hopeful it's going to make a really positive change to what's going on here.
Our guest this episode is Professor Richard Kingsford. Professor Kingsford is the Director of the Centre for Ecosystem Science at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. He is a river ecologist and conservation biologist whose work has significantly improved our understanding of how water resource developments impact river and wetland ecosystems. Professor Kingsford's work has been awarded both Eureka and Banksia Awards and earned him fellowships of both the Royal Society of New South Wales and the Australian Zoological Society. In 2021, he was awarded the ESA Gold Medal for his outstanding contributions to ecology.
Yeah, I was always sort of interested in birds, and I had a grandmother who passed a pair of binoculars to me when I was probably about 6, and she certainly got me interested in the bird part of it and natural history. And that was in Kenya in Africa, where I was born and brought up till I was about 12. And then my parents migrated to Australia, and they were farmers in Africa. So I had that background. And then they also bought a farm in Australia, and I went to high school in Sydney. And I had to probably went through a stage of being a bit disappointed that there were no elephants and sunbirds and the same sort of big mammal diversity in Australia. And so when I started doing zoology at university, I started to get more of a passion for it. And then I did my PhD on the ecology of wood ducks. And I guess that sort of really got me going in terms of thinking broadly about ecology and its as a discipline. And it's been really interesting because I think at one stage I was certainly on a farming career path. I was going to be a cattle and sheep farmer. Certainly that was my full-on background. But I did at one stage decide I didn't want to do an agricultural science degree. I wanted to do something different in terms of what I was interested in, which is the natural world. But I think what it really has done for me is understand what we're doing to the planet in large parts of the world in terms of food and fibre production. It's certainly given me an understanding of the motivations of people who are trying to make a buck out of the land, but also, I think, a really good understanding of the damage that farming practices can do to the natural world. And I guess more recently it's, and probably even from the start, although I didn't realize it it in thinking I was just working on natural ecology. It sort of much more of the social ecological dimensions related to the Anthropocene and, how are we going to sustain the natural world given these enormous human pressures disrupting the ecology of, every system on the planet. And so that interaction of humans and natural world ecology is certainly driven a lot of what I've been doing. And I think I might have started off thinking that, I could quite happily spend all of my career studying wood ducks and their courtship behavior, which was fascinating, and then moving on to another species perhaps. And I think every ecologist, once they get into something, realizes how little we know about a particular organism. But when I started working for the National Parks and Wildlife Service as a scientist, I started to think hard about, the large scale issues around conservation and, how do we best go about looking after these amazing natural systems, particularly in rivers and wetlands, to make sure that they are sort of sustained for future generations. It was really, I could have probably gone in any maybe bird direction initially, but the fact that I was working on waterbirds and I got a job at national parks running the Eastern Australian Aerial Waterbird Survey, which covers about a third of the continent and had been going a couple of years, started in 1983, and really, I sort of finished my PhD and the job came up and I thought, beggars can't be choosers here. So this sort of lines up with my interests and maybe I should throw my hat in the ring, although I think like a lot of PhD students, I was sort of over doing research and writing it up and thought that I needed a bit of time off, but I was lucky enough to get the job and I sort of grew into that job, and the interest extended beyond wood ducks and farm dams to thinking about wetlands and sustainability of rivers. And I think probably because I was flying over a third of the continent, I was thinking about these at scale. And when the rivers of the Lake Eyre Basin were flooding, I was flying over the top of those rivers, but 2 days later, I'd be over a massive Channel Country floodplain. And you really start to think not only about the ecological response, but the potential there for, major disruption of these magnificent systems. And I think when I really got into the river debate and the issues around water management, it was after flying over the Macquarie Marshes for a few years and starting to really appreciate some of the major declines that were occurring as a result of what was happening hundreds of kilometres upstream.
And also obviously impacted by issues like climate change that, obviously having a much larger scale impact on our water resources.
That's right. And the climate change story for water is interesting because it certainly is drying up the continent, higher temperatures, and in some parts having major impacts on flow regimes, although rainfall patterns in some areas are still pretty uncertain. But I think compared to what we've done to rivers by building dams and taking too much water out, it's like a certain topping on the top of that impact pressure that's occurred with that major sort of disruption that we've been doing in terms of harnessing water for what we need in terms of our food and fibre. I think the solution's there, it's obvious, but I don't see a lot of political will in terms of fixing it. Certainly in the Murray-Darling Basin, we've seen considerable impetus from governments to return water to the rivers, but it's been a hard slog politically for them. And because, so many communities and industries, irrigation in particular depends, its life and death is about water. So, it becomes a very difficult issue to progress because there isn't a win-win in these. It's either the environment loses or the irrigation industry. And of course, it's not just the environment, because that water is important for fishing and grazing industries and First Nations people downstream. But I think, like a lot of intractable environmental problems, they are fundamentally about, this our one species demanding more and more of the world's natural resources, and whether that's in consuming the natural resources or in fact polluting, given that climate change is a type of pollution, polluting the natural world, that's obviously putting enormous pressure on the natural ecology of both Australian ecosystems, but also global ones.
You've been involved in several advisory panels and boards and commissions to help government and non-government bodies to find solutions to environmental problems like this. Why do you feel that role is important, and do you feel like it's making a difference?
I think I have to feel it's making a difference. I may be deluding myself sometimes on that. But yes, look, I do think, and I sort of regularly say this to my first year students who get depressed about the state of the planet and, the pressures, that in my career, there have been some real wins in terms of some of these environmental issues and some big political issues, like, for example, the rivers of the Murray-Darling Basin. Often I find that you might have had one particular win, but 10 years later, everybody's forgotten and the pressures are still there. So it's an ongoing battle. But I do think a lot of these major environmental problems are not really about lack of knowledge. A lot of us scientists know what should be done, and we can advise various people what needs to be done, but actually getting it done is quite a different matter. And I guess part of what I think my role in terms of being on various non-government and government advisory groups is, how do I best advocate for some of these changes to become part of the momentum of government and non-government, and non-government being a potential pressure process on the wheels of government. And I think the important thing here is, as a scientist, I think it's obviously very necessary to do the science that allows us to understand the processes and ecology of organisms. But for someone who wants to maintain that ecology, I guess I'm really interested to be able to say, well, what next? What would you do to make sure that fascinating ecology that you're seeing continues for the future? And I think in large part, we've got to change some of the decisions that have been made and would be made if you weren't able to provide that information through to decision makers. So I guess that's the sort of space that I think is really important to occupy now, and as well as doing the research, as well as sort of communicating more broadly to the public.
Ecology Matters is a podcast by the Ecological Society of Australia, a not-for-profit organisation supporting ecologists and ecological science in Australia. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. To learn more about our work, follow us on social media, visit our website or sign up to our newsletter. You can find links to these in the show notes. This episode was produced by Grace Heathcote and Elodie Comprassi. The theme music is Glow by Scott Buckley. Lastly, thank you to all the ecologists who have taken part in this series and shared their perspectives on why ecology matters.